The Holocaust was a devastating time for millions of people. Many lives were changed and lost during the years of mass genocide in Europe. People often wonder, how did the Nazis justify killing millions of people? This film will introduce you to the idea of scientific racism and eugenics. It will provide you with insight as to how the Nazis biologically justified what they were doing in order to create the master race. We'll also consider the use of this Nazi practice in today's society. Are doctors taking it too far with genetic testing? Are we not striving for the master race to some extent in today's world as well? According to the dictionary, eugenics is defined as the study of or belief in the possibility of improving the qualities of the human species or a human population, especially by such means as discouraging reproduction by persons having genetic defects or presumed to have inheritable undesirable traits. Eugenics has been around for hundreds of years. It wasn't something that was newly introduced during the Holocaust, but it did give the Nazis justification for what they were doing. The Nazi Party was full of men who considered themselves German social Darwinists. They took Darwin's survival of the fittest theory and applied it to humans, meaning they felt it was necessary for only certain more superior people to pass on their genes and create offspring. Even before Hitler rose to power, a number of physicians formed the National Socialist Physicians League in 1929 to coordinate Nazi medical policy and purify the German medical community. The League was a huge success. 6% of all the physicians in Germany joined the group within 4 years of it being introduced, and actually more doctors joined the Nazi Party earlier than any other professional group. There were 2 institutes that considered racial hygiene their top research goal: the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology in Berlin and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Genealogy in Munich. In May 1933, Hitler introduced a law to legalize eugenic sterilization. This law allowed sterilization of those who were deemed physically or mentally handicapped, so that they would not pass on their bad genes to future generations. 2 months later, in July, Hitler introduced the Law for Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. This law ordered that people with certain psychological and mental handicaps were to be forcibly sterilized, and sometimes even murdered. What the Nazis considered mental or physical handicaps included schizophrenia, severe hereditary physical deformity, and deafness, among other things. Now, the scientists who were conducting these experiments couldn't continue with their research at a very fast pace because they wanted to be backed by the state. And when Hitler's sterilization law in 1933 passed, that gave them the okay from governing officials to continue with their experiments. One of Germany's leading racial hygienists, Alfred Plowitz, helped to write this law, and it was not to be taken lightly. To help physicians determine who was to be sterilized, the German Medical Association founded a journal, The Genetic Doctor. The journal also provided the latest sterilization techniques to be used. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws came into effect. The law for protection of German blood and honor stated marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Aryan Germans were forbidden. The Reich citizenship law defined who was to count as a citizen in the Third Reich and who was not. These decisions were based on how pure the person's blood was. They were considered public health measures and were administered by physicians. In 1936, the marital laws went into effect, and the responsibility of administering these laws were marriage counseling centers. However, during this time, they were renamed genetic counseling centers. In the winter of 1938 to 1939, Hitler set up a group, the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registration of Serious Hereditary and Congenitally Based Illnesses, that was in charge of killing handicapped children that were unwanted. All doctors and midwives were to report children born with deformities. The cases were then reviewed by the board of 3 pediatricians who determined whether or not the child should live or die. This euthanasia program served as a sort of trial run that allowed doctors involved to experiment with killing methods, basically. And it also served as a way for doctors to experiment on live patients so as to possibly further their own careers. Not long after the children's euthanasia program began was an adult euthanasia program created. The T4 program, as it was referred to, targeted adults that were institutionalized with mental disabilities. Before any murders ensued, Dr. Leonardo Conti, the Reich doctors leader and state secretary in the Interior Ministry responsible for health matters, developed a formula to reach a target number of deaths. This formula estimated that 10 of every 1,000 people in the German Reich needed psychiatric treatment, and 5 of those 10 needed to be institutionalized, and 1 of those 5 were ordered to be euthanized. This formula targeted about 65 to 75,000 people in Germany, and forms were made up by Dr. Conti and sent to all the mental institutions, and doctors decided if the patient lived or died. Some doctors refused to participate, but it wasn't a big deal. They weren't penalized because there were so many doctors that were willing to help run the program. T4 greatly contributed to experimentation of different killing methods. The experts that ran the camps discovered the most effective ways to kill large amounts of people, and the first gassing successfully occurred at an insane asylum close to Berlin in January of 1940. Why was no one doing anything to stop these euthanasia programs, you ask? Well, once the news of the killings became more frequently discussed, people did stand up against it, specifically the Catholic Bishop of Munster, Cardinal August Count von Galen. Von Galen preached a sermon that allowed the Nazis to know he knew what was happening and that he thought it was a crime against humanity. The sermon became well known throughout Europe and the world. Von Galen's sermon influenced Hitler to call off the euthanasia program in August 1941, but in reality the T4 program only increased in secrecy. Hitler never intended for any of the killings to stop. He only wanted to look good in the public eye. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about racial hygiene. And according to the founders of racial hygiene, Alfred Plowitz and Wilhelm Schallmeyer, racial hygiene was supposed to complement personal and social hygiene and provide long-run preventive medicine for the German germplasm by combating, for example, the disproportionate breeding of inferiors. The Jewish problem, as it was described, was often referred to as a public health problem, and the German Medical Association even published a regular column titled "Solving the Jewish Problem" during World War II. The main idea during this time period after the Nuremberg trials was that diseases such as homosexuality, insanity, and flat feet were more common among Jews than among those who were racially superior. As the war continued and the Jews were forced into ghettos, the ghettos were often referred to as places of quarantine, and only medical personnel could grant admission and exit. Medical journals in the 1940s called the Jewish race a diseased race. They used the high statistic of typhus cases in ghettos and correlated them to the Jewish race, and not the fact that the Jews were living in close quarters and poor living conditions. By the end of 1941, the Germans decided that there needed to be a more effective way to kill the Jews, preferably one that was less psychologically exhausting for the Germans. So at the Wannsee Conference, German government officials and Nazi Party officials that were directly involved in the mass murdering of the Jewish people decided that if they wanted to reach their goal of killing 11 million Jews across Europe, they had to come up with a more effective way to kill. The officials decided that killing centers with gas chambers was the most ideal method. Where did they get this idea? The T4 program, of course. The T4 program was the first to gas their victims. Since then, other gas chambers had been built to dispose of those that the Nazis deemed unworthy of life because of a mental handicap. The gas chambers that had been established in psychiatric hospitals were removed and shipped to Majdanek, Auschwitz, and Treblinka. The doctors, technicians, and nurses who ran these facilities at the hospitals often followed the chambers to the death camps because they were considered experts on the topic. The ideas of a superior race sound absolutely absurd and unthinkable, right? But what kind of message do doctors send when they talk of new genetic discoveries today? Today's research is much more advanced than anything was happening 60 years ago, and now parents have the options to test for genetic defects that their babies might have while the baby is still in utero. If the baby does have a genetic defect or disorder, will the parents decide to have an abortion? It's possible. This has many similarities to the practice of the Nazis killing those small children who were physically deformed or handicapped in some way. A new practice, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, permits scientists to diagnose genetic conditions in an in vitro embryo prior to implantation in the uterus. This way, a genetically defective embryo would not be implanted. Only the best embryos would be saved for implantation. That sounds similar to the board of pediatricians choosing which children lived and died. Granted, the embryos are not fully developed, but some would say that an embryo is indeed a living being. Not only was the Holocaust filled with racism and hatred, but also with hours of research and science. The Nazis felt that the Jews truly were racially inferior, and they were willing to do anything to prove that, or at least stop them from reproducing. The Nazis tried to justify everything they were doing with biological ideals, Darwin's theory, and science. And with everything that is going on with genetics today, some of their ideals may have rubbed off.